Today I'm going to be talking about the Progressive Era, the Progressive Movement. The Progressive Movement that began in the 1890s was an attempt to address problems created by industrial growth and change. Some key issues were problems that came from the laissez-faire economic system, such as working conditions, living conditions, etc. Conservative versus progressive views. Conservatives wanted a free market, while progressives wanted laws to regulate unfair business practices and laws to protect consumers/the public from the negatives of industrial growth. They believed that the government should police businesses. The progressive movement is not the same as the populist movement. The populists were more concerned with reform in rural areas versus progressives who were more focused on reform in cities. Increasing inequality. From 1865 to the early 1900s, there was great inequality between the rich and the poor. Remember that the wealthy were supported by the idea of social Darwinism. In contrast to the wealthy, millions of workers worked long hours for low pay and often in dangerous conditions. The women actually started entering the workforce in crazy numbers in the late 19th century and were treated to the same working conditions. Progressive reformers, due to the great disparity in economic status, wanted political and economic change. The rising power of the middle class/newspapers. Progressive candidates heavily relied on the support of the middle class and newspapers. Post-Civil War, both had grown more due to industrial growth. The middle class read a lot, which meant that newspapers heavily influenced their political and economic opinions. Many middle-class men and women supported causes that were related to their opinions. Men voted regularly, while women participated in charities, clubs, and took part in reform movements. The middle class took pride in the U.S. growth due to industrialization. And also, yellow journalism started to emerge. Yellow journalism is journalism that's based on exaggeration. Key examples of this is Pulitzer and Hearst's newspapers. Consumer protection and journalism. Journalists were crucial to the progressive movement, and books and articles prompted Americans to address issues of society. Many journalists were muckrakers. A muckraker is a journalist who exposes the social ills and political/corporate corruption. Muckrakers exposed factory conditions, dirty politics, and government corruption. A famous example of this is The Jungle by Upton Sinclair in 1906, which exposed the horrors of the Chicago meatpacking industry. And there was some legislation that was passed due to the exposing from muckrakers, such as the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906, which banned manufacturing and the sale of impure foods, drugs, liquors, and required truthful bottling and labeling of medicine. And we also have the Meat Inspection Act in 1906, which gave the U.S. officials the power to check the quality and healthfulness of meat shipped in interstate commerce. Social and economic reform. Smaller movements. By small movement, I mean like a movement that doesn't have as much to talk about compared to big movements such as black rights and women rights. First, we have the social gospel movement. Protestant ministers sought to bring help to the urban poor as they believed the church had religious duties but also had duties to help the poor/new immigrants. Then we have tenement reform. Jacob Riis, in his book, exposes the horrors of tenements to the middle class, and he promoted efforts to reduce overcrowding and improve sanitary conditions in tenements. The New York, the state of New York, actually created the Tenement Housing Commission. There was a tenement law passed in 1901 that stated new buildings need to have windows, indoor bathrooms, and that inspectors could check sanitary conditions of buildings when necessary. Then we have the settlement house movement. Jane Addams established settlement houses, and settlement houses were places which provided activities for poor children and classes for immigrant families. Some more smaller movements. Well, this is not really a small movement, but temperance/prohibition. People in this movement argued that excessive alcohol consumption increased poverty in working class families. And in 1919, they achieved the goal through the 18th Amendment until it was canceled out in 1933. Then we have the Anti-Defamation League. Jewish immigrants were tired of native-born religious and cultural prejudice. They wanted to combat anti-Semitism. Progressives also campaigned against the exploitation of children. By 1914, every state had some form of child labor laws. However, some were still weak. And mandatory education requirements grew, and engineers and urban planners built bridges and tunnels to make cities safer. Some big social and economic movements. Number one, women's reform. The suffrage movement, the movement to gain equal voting rights for women. The first suffrage, first sign of suffrage actually happened in western states, such as 1869 in Wyoming. And Susan B. Anthony came up with the idea for an amendment for women's suffrage in all states in 1878, but that got rejected constantly. Finally, after a lot of pressure, Congress passed the 19th Amendment in 1920 that finally gave women the right to vote in all states. There was also a fight for birth control. Margaret Sanger, who was a nurse, observed that many working-class women were suffering increased poverty due to frequent pregnancies. She wanted to educate/help women, so she wrote a book and opened the first birth control clinic. Another big movement was black movement/reform. Here's some background. Jim Crow laws were established in the South that led to increased racial segregation, especially in the 1880s and 90s. Black leaders tried to challenge the laws and win support of the white reformers. We have Booker T. Washington, who was a big leader who advised many business tycoons and even the president. We have W.E.B. Du Bois, who established the Niagara Movement, which protested and publicized acts of injustice against blacks. We also have the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1909. This is where white reformers combined with the Niagara members to create this organization, and it helped defend those who were accused of crimes only due to race. Part 2 of Black Movement and Reform. Even though most whites failed to consider the rights of blacks, the NAACP lawyers managed to win many civil rights cases. And from 1915 to 1917, Supreme Court declared the Grandfather Clause, segregated housing laws, the denying of black rights to be on juries, and the denying of blacks' rights to run for office as unconstitutional. We also have the anti-lynching movement. Ida B. Wells observed the horrors of lynchings, which there were over 1,000 lynchings from 1900 to 1914, and she actually dedicated her career to the cause of racial justice. Then we have Marcus Garvey, I think that's how you say it, and rather than fighting for the integration of blacks into white society, he created the Negro Improvement Association, which urged blacks to move back to Africa rather than seek white acceptance. However, he was deported back to Jamaica in 1927 for fraud. Progressive political reform. The progressive early days, 1890 through 1900, were focused on local and state levels, until 1901 when Roosevelt was elected president. The growing middle class opposed political machines. They wanted lower taxes, and they wanted to reduce the cost of government and wanted to improve public services. Political machines were the city's governing organization that was usually more concerned about staying in power rather than taking care of the city. The middle class didn't like how the political machines basically forced votes from immigrants. The middle class attempted to break up political machines as there was a growing need for fiscal responsibilities in cities. So mayors were voted in to remove corrupt personnel, but they often didn't stay in power as they did not meet the needs of ethnic groups. Political Reform Part 2. State reform. The state of Wisconsin was elaborate for reform. They used reforms to beat railroads, political bosses, and business interests. And they ended up becoming a model for the rest of the country. And then finally, states started to adopt some of these reforms, such as a direct primary, which is the nomination of state officials through popular vote rather than convention. Then we have another reform, which is by signing a petition, small percent of voters could force state legislature to consider laws. Proposed laws could be directly submitted to the people to vote on in an election. And in special elections, people can vote whether or not to remove elected officials from before their term ends. Along with some of these state reforms, states started to adopt the Australian ballot. An Australian ballot is where voters can vote in private and with a government issued ballot versus party issued ballots. We also have the conservation of nature. I'll go more in depth about this topic in the Progressive Presidents videos because most of this was under Roosevelt. Roosevelt used the Forest Reserve Act to establish over 100 national forests, and he also established 2 new laws that greatly helped conservation. And finally, here's a chart summary of progressive movement reform effects. First, we have political. We have party primaries. There was a split in Republican Party. I'll go more in depth about that in the other video. We have the decline of machine politics. Then we have women's suffrage. Some social effects. We have laws protecting workers, settlement houses and social work, birth control for women, and the beginning of the civil rights movement for African Americans. Some economic effects with the conservation of land and water, regulation of businesses. We'll talk about that more. Lower tariffs. The rest of these I'm going to talk about more in the next video, but we have lower tariffs, reform banking system, and the federal income tax.